Psalm 11. To the choir master of David. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot at the dark, in the dark, at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked, fire and sulfur, and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I was saying to someone just a minute ago that I really don't like dancing and I'm not a good dancer. And that means I, for many reasons besides this, would not be a good New Zealand rugby player. Because as you probably know, at the start of all their rugby matches, they do a kind of war dance, the haka, where they try and intimidate in various bizarre ways the opposition, and opposition have to just stand there and watch it. The purpose of the haka is to intimidate, is to scare, it's to try and get some psychological edge over the enemy just by pulling funny faces and stamping and vibrating and all the stuff they do. What are you meant to do before such intimidation? And let's face it, the haka is just a kind of watered down version of the intimidation we face in real life. Well, what they're trying to get you to do is to retreat. Every general knows, every military strategist knows, the best way to win a battle is not to fight it at all. It's just to force people to pack it in themselves. And in this psalm, we're seeing the psalmist respond to that kind of intimidation. The intimidation that might come from real enemies, people we actually know, might come in some subtle way from our colleagues or families, might come in our own hearts from the devil himself, our great enemy, who wants to intimidate us, so we just fold and say, okay, I give up, I retreat, I'm out. Now, of course, there are two types of retreat. There's the strategic retreat, where you see what's coming and realize I'll move around and be able to live to fight another day. But the type of retreat that the psalmist is being tempted to do here is a retreat that comes from cowardice, that says, I'm just in disarray, I've got no chance, I've just got to get out while I still can and save my skin. This psalm records a temptation to be a coward. And strangely enough, in the New Testament, one of the things that is listed alongside much more serious sounding sins is cowardice. So this is a psalm that we need to take to heart in the various ways that we feel intimidated, the various ways that we feel the temptation to just fold, just run away, just hide. So let's look first at the temptation to be a coward, and then we'll look at the response to it. In the Lord I take refuge. That's going to frame the whole thing, and we'll come back to it. But then the psalmist records what somebody apparently has said, either to him directly or to his soul, imagined words of his enemies. And what do they say? Flee like a bird to your mountain. Now, when you know the story of David, and perhaps this is still fitting into that the big story that we saw back in Psalm 3, where David's being chased out of Jerusalem by Absalom. When you know the life story of David, you see flee like a bird to your mountain as a really quite potent little jab. Because David was somebody who'd fled to a mountain before. In the book of 1 Samuel, we see King Saul chasing David around, and various times in comical ways. He's hiding in caves in the mountain, and he goes round one side of the mountain and Saul chases him. David even says of Saul, "Why were you pursuing me like a partridge to the mountains?" And so perhaps if we're to imagine this situation with Absalom again, from 2 Samuel 13 onwards, we're to imagine them saying to David, oh yeah, we know you. You're the fleeing guy. You're the guy who has his special mountain he goes to when things get difficult. You're the guy who folds, who runs away. Flee like a bird to your mountain. You remember the time before that you fled? So the temptation is not to retreat, because I guess it was the previous times that David retreated, it was a tactical retreat. It was a wise thing to do. The temptation is to despair or to cowardice. The temptation is to fold and say, I've got no chance here, no hope. Absalom's taken over the city. I've had to run out already with a handful of trusted advisors. I'm going to go. It's over. And the temptation goes on in verse 2. It is an immediate threat. Behold, the wicked bend the bow. They fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. That image, we've seen that image before, of an arrow on the string, ready to be fired, loaded. Previously in Psalm 7, it was in the hands of God himself, pointed at the wicked. Our tempters, our enemies, want us to forget about that. They want us to see what looks imminent, the threat that's right there. If you follow through with this faithfulness to the Lord thing, your life will look ridiculous. Your future will fold. Look, the danger's right there. The arrow is on the string to shoot at the dark in the upright at heart. Then in verse 3, the temptation goes on to say, and it's not like you have any help. That's what this verse, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? I think that's what it means, is you've got nothing left to lean on. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, this idea of the foundations sometimes speaks about God's saints, his holy people, especially the eminent ones in the society, that those are the people you can rely on who might back you up. He says they're destroyed, they're gone. Again, think of David fleeing from Absalom. Absalom's captured the city. He's already won over most of the key figures in society. They're gone, David. Just give up. Other times, the foundations idea in the Old Testament seems to refer to the law itself and to justice. If there no longer is any justice, what can the righteous do? Perhaps that's how it feels as you look around. Not just at your own heart. Of course, we see the flaws in our own heart. We see our own law breaking, but we see as well, as we look around in the world, how anything that might match up to God's law is ridiculed. We look at pluralism or blasphemy. We look at rampant immorality. We look at the slaughter of the unborn. We look at assisted dying. We look at the total disregard for truth among our politicians and think, have they got all of the Ten Commandments and just said, which ones can we trash the most? The foundations seem to be destroyed. What can the righteous do? Yes, it does appear hopeless. Yes, in many ways, the temptation is playing on something that's real. A real crisis. A real unwinnable situation. There are plenty of card games where you look at the cards that have been dealt out to you and realize you've got no chance of winning, so you just put them down. I fold. And our enemies, spiritual or real or personal, wish us to think of our situation like that. They want us to look at our hand as just a few tiny percentage of Christians in this city and think we've got nothing to do, no hope. The best we can do is survive, if that. Again, let me say clearly, sometimes it is the right thing to make a tactical retreat, but that's not what the temptation is here. The temptation is to cave, is to cowardice. It does appear hopeless. It does appear like Christianity is on its last legs. G.K. Chesterton has a famous line. He's got many famous quips, but here's one that came to my mind as I was studying this psalm this week. Chesterton wrote, "Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave." Jesus himself was someone who was tempted to despair, tempted to fold, tempted to leave the path that he was following, tempted to see that it was impossible, it was pointless, He was going to lose. The Pharisees in Luke 13 tried to tempt him away from his path, saying, look, Herod's going to kill you. And he persisted nevertheless. Even Peter himself began to rebuke Jesus when he spoke of the path he must walk to death and the cross. Even Satan, the temptations of Jesus in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, they're all about Satan himself saying to Jesus, you don't have to go through this path that you think God has set up for you, this path of obedience, of suffering, of death. There's a quicker way, a shorter way. Come my way, and I'll make you king of the world. Again, let us note that Jesus sometimes did escape and withdraw. Perhaps he too was someone who would have felt the bite of this flee like a bird to your mountain. For there were times that Jesus went to desolate places, to literally mountains, to flee the people who were persecuting him. But in the end, his path was towards a mountain, towards Jerusalem, towards Calvary and the cross. And he walked it to the very end. No intimidation could deter our God and Saviour as he walked to the cross. What about us? Perhaps we feel how impossible life as a Christian is. Perhaps we feel the burden of our duties, our responsibilities. We just think, I can't live it like this. I can't walk this way. I know I haven't been a pastor for many years, but just a couple of years ago, a deep sense of, if I carry on being a minister, I will certainly suffer some portion of what Christ himself suffered, of slander, of rejection, of failure. Sorely tempted to despair, to just fold and say, okay, if it's impossible now, with all these things that are stacked against me, then I'll go and do something else. Perhaps you feel the same thing in your responsibilities as a mother or a husband or a boss or whatever other situations you have, even just over your own life. I cannot conquer this sin, this struggle, this suffering. Well, we ought to feel that temptation with the weight that it has. Just as the psalmist describes here. These temptations are weighty, they're heavy, they weigh upon us. But we must not despair. We must not think, do you know what, I'll fold and just, as long as I can save my own skin. No. What should we do instead? Well, here's the second thing, our response to that temptation. Well, it's summed up in just half of one verse. Verse 1, in the Lord I take refuge. Remember that if this is talking about the situation with Absalom that David has been alluding to throughout these last few Psalms, he really didn't have anywhere to flee to. He must have felt in many senses that he didn't have a refuge, nowhere left to go. But he says, in the Lord I take refuge. Why? Verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man. This is the same idea that we've had in both Psalm 9 and 10. We've had this strong emphasis on God's throne and on the fact that he sees everything that goes on, every persecution, every suffering, every sin. He sees every one of them. He's in his holy temple. And I take it David doesn't mean there the physical copy of the temple that he saw on Mount Zion, because he says the Lord's throne is in heaven. That's where he really is, in his real throne, his real seat, where he looks down on everything and rules it without any failure. And what is that Lord going to do? Verse 5, the Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked, fire and sulfur, and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. Now, we've seen this the last couple of Psalms, so I'm not going to sort of dive deeply into it again. But let me just remind you that the Lord really does see and really will judge the wicked, and that would include all of us, but for Christ, right down to the very last sin. And again, we're seeing here how on the one hand, that's his doing. He rains the coals down, that vivid image. On the other hand, it's their choice, the portion of their cup, as if they went around the cafeteria and said, yeah, I'll have the Lord's judgment on my wickedness. What's striking, though, is that when it says his eyelids test the children of man, it immediately says the Lord tests the righteous. So as much as our temptations really do come from wicked actors, people who are seeking to destroy us, the devil himself who's seeking to undermine our faith, at the same time, it is a test from the Lord. Now, we might find that distasteful in some ways. How could the Lord let us go through such things? We might find that confusing or mysterious in some ways. I think the more you think about it, the more mysterious it is. But let me encourage you also to find that deeply comforting, that the Lord is in charge of all of this. David himself, having been cast out of the city, tempted by whoever his enemies are, feeling completely hopeless, the Lord is testing him. The Lord has him in the palm of his hand. The Lord will preserve him. And he knows it. Verse 7, for the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. And that's why when we're faced with the real choice between righteous deeds, walking God's ways, and whatever we're tempted to do to save our own skin, we must choose the righteous deeds. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the prudent thing to do. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord is righteous. The upright shall behold his face. Jesus himself, we read in the book of Hebrews, learnt obedience through suffering. The reality is that a fruitful life in the model of Christ involves suffering, involves losing, involves situations which feel impossible, involves pressures that we feel we can't bear, involves temptations that feel beyond our power to resist. The message of Psalm 11 is, don't lose heart. Don't despair. Don't fold. Don't give up under that intimidation. For that's what it is. The Lord is at the top of the tree. The Lord is on his throne. The Lord sees. And the Lord blesses the righteous. Jesus told a parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. And it's a parable which is stuck in my head, such that I think about it kind of every few weeks. It just comes back in. Jesus told this story where a range of different guys, his servants, the master's servants, were given talents to do stuff with. Talents was a measure of money. Two of the guys put it to work and made a profit for the master, but one of them was afraid. So he hid the talent in the ground. And when the master comes back, demanding a return on his investment, he says, I was afraid, so I hid your talent in the ground. He was someone who felt this temptation and folded, who thought, I'll just play it safe. I'll flee like a bird to my mountain. I'll give up on my responsibilities to others. I'll give up on my responsibilities to my master. I'll give up on my ambitions to serve him and please him. That's the best I can manage under this pressure in this situation. That is the temptation that faces all of us. To think, I'll just survive if I can just survive. But the Lord calls us instead to take refuge in him, the perfect safe place, and so not only to just survive, but to be righteous, to do righteous deeds, and so in the end, to behold his face. Let me underline again, this is about cowardice. This isn't just about retreat. Some people would say, well, that's why we have to be constantly on the front lines of engaging with our culture at all times. I think there is a place for a tactical retreat, not a cowardly retreat, in various kinds of situations. I think there's a very good case, for example, for quite a protective, almost retreatist approach to raising children today. But even our tactical retreats mustn't be cowardly ones, faithless ones, self-preserving ones. They must instead be ones that say, I take refuge in the Lord. Whatever happens as a result of this, I trust in him. Whatever situations and temptations come, I'll walk in his ways. Can I say that this passage kind of fairly obviously applies to us? as we leave behind St. Leonard's and the Church of England and start this new church, it would be very easy for us to feel that what we're doing is fleeing like a bird to our mountain, is finding our own rather pathetic refuge. May it not be so. It needn't be so. Far from it. I think what we've done is a good thing and for good reasons. But resist the temptation to flee, to try and find some secret hidden place where you can't be harmed. There is no such place, not this side of heaven itself. We are called, as we've seen in 1 Peter, to a life where we've been called out of darkness into his marvelous light, where we live in his righteous ways, where some people see it and love it, where most people see it and hate it, where most people mock us, most people tempt us, most people intimidate us if they have the chance at all. Most people give us the cold shoulder, the most powerful intimidation of all. We don't even care. We take refuge in the Lord, for the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. And let's not forget the very last line of this psalm. The upright behold his face. The psalmist doesn't just appeal to the throne of heaven, far off, unreachable, somewhere he can never come, but at least God's got his back. He expects to come before the very throne of that same heaven and that same Lord and behold his face in the end. Surely the psalmist David himself must have known that he was not worthy of that in himself. But he had confidence in the God who had chosen him, whether to the extent he knew it, I don't know, in the Christ who died for him, so that he knew whatever happened to him, whatever turned out in the Absalom incident or any of the other mad, dangerous situations of David's life, whatever they led to, in the end, he would behold the face of the Lord, the source of all blessing and life and goodness. That is our final destiny, whatever happens in this life. So don't be intimidated by whatever seeks to threaten and call you to cowardice. Instead, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain?